Welcome to the last video in this fourth lecture, where we're going to talk about rainfall and plant available soil moisture. So I know that Professor McAuliffe talked about this already, so I don't really want to go over the mechanisms in too much detail about why plants need water. Other than, to photosynthesize, crops transpire. In other words, their stomates open to allow carbon dioxide in, and as they're doing that, water is going to leave that leaf because there's 100% relative humidity inside the leaf, so that air is just going to diffuse out of the stomates into the air in transpiration. Transpiration and photosynthesis are intimately linked, and you can see on this graph here, the more transpiration, the more yield. Okay, that's as detailed as I'll get into it for the purposes of this lecture. In a farm field, we don't just have transpiration going on. We also have evaporation. And the sum of evaporation and transpiration are what we call evapotranspiration. There we go. And that's the total amount of water essentially leaving that cropping system. One thing to note is that over the growing season, the relative contributions of evaporation and transpiration to evapotranspiration change. So early in the season, when we just before emergence, or when we have seedlings, and these are very small crops that are not transpiring very much, evaporation is almost 100% of evapotranspiration. In other words, there's very little transpiration going on. But once that crop achieves full canopy coverage, that soil is being shaded, it's protected from the wind, and almost all of evapotranspiration is from transpiration. There's very little evaporation going on. And so if you're in a water-limited environment, so say you're in the prairies or the Peace River Valley, you're going to want to minimize evaporation as much as possible and save as much of that water for transpiration, because again, transpiration is directly related to yield. If you're in a place like Ontario or Eastern Canada, where we have very wet winters, and coming into May, when planting typically occurs, soils are saturated, well then a farmer might want to encourage evaporation to dry those soils out so they can actually be able to, for example, conduct tillage or planting operations, because if the soil is going to be too wet, they can't do those activities. The other arrow in this picture is precipitation. It's pointing downwards, right? That is rainfall. And it's important to understand that from a cropping system perspective, not all precipitation is made available to that crop. Sometimes that rainfall is going to run off. Okay, it won't even infiltrate into the soil, and so if that rainfall runs off, it can't be transpired, right? It's not in the field anymore. And assuming that precipitation and rainfall gets into the soil profile, not all of it will be able to be transpired by that crop. Now, this is where we have to touch on some soil science, and I understand this is a plant agriculture course, but the fact is that depending on a number of soil attributes, that rainfall, that input of precipitation, only a fraction of it will actually be available for crop use. And the amount of water that's available for crop use, what we call plant available soil moisture, depends on water potential. Okay, now this is basically a physics concept that we don't really have to define too precisely in this course, but let's think about it like this. When it rains a lot on a field, let's say it completely saturates that soil, it stops raining, that soil is going to start draining. In other words, that water, that moisture that's in the soil is going to start moving downwards by the force of gravity to deeper soil layers. But it's not like 100% of that water is just going to keep moving downwards. Some water is going to stay in those upper soil layers. And it's going to stay in those upper soil layers because the gravitational forces that are acting downwards on that water are being successfully resisted by other forces, specifically matrix potential. So soil particles are, via capillary action, are keeping, or surface tension, are keeping water in that soil against gravity that's pulling it downwards. And so the maximum amount of water that can be held against gravity is called the field capacity. And that is basically, for a free draining soil, the maximum amount of plant available water. So looking at this graph, which has soil texture on the x-axis, we can see that in a clay soil, field capacity is equal to about 25%, let's say. And that means that a free draining clay soil, after being completely wetted, it's allowed to drain for a day or two, it's going to have 25% volumetric soil water content. If you do that same experiment, you add the same amount of water to a sandy soil. Okay, you add the same amount of water, allow it to drain freely for a day or two. You come back and see what's the volumetric soil moisture percent or water percentage. It's going to be around 5%. Okay, and again, that has to do with differences in the matrix potential surface tension of that soil. So that's what we call field capacity, the maximum amount of water that soil can hold. So let's say we have a crop growing in that soil now. So that soil, that crop is transpiring. It's taking moisture out of that soil and transpiring it into the atmosphere. It's growing. And the moisture content of that soil is going down as that crop keeps transpiring that soil water. And just as those matrix potentials resisted gravity and kept that water from going further down, eventually as that soil moisture content goes down, percent soil moisture goes down, those matrix forces, that surface tension, is going to protect that surface water, that soil water, against crop uptake. And so the roots, it's going to protect that water from being taken up by the roots and transpired by the crops. And that typically occurs at a much lower soil moisture content than field capacity. And that's what we call the wilting point. But at volumetric, at soil water percents below the wilting point, a crop cannot transpire. It actually cannot pull the water out of that soil because the soil is holding onto that moisture too strongly. Okay, so what we have when we put these two things together, the field capacity and the wilting point, and you can see the technical definitions here, you can see that the difference between field capacity and wilting point, that is plant available water. That is water that the crop can transpire. It's the difference between field capacity and the wilting point, or in this graph, it's the wilting coefficient. So just looking at this graph, we can see that, if you wanted a soil texture that had the most plant available water, the biggest difference between field capacity and wilting point, you wouldn't choose a sand, you probably wouldn't choose a clay, you would probably choose something like a loam or a silt loam soil, because the amount of available water for a crop is largest in these soil textures. But the takeaway here is that you can have the same amount of rainfall falling on a piece of land, and depending on the soil texture, you're going to have differences in field capacity, so how much water is remaining in the soil after rainfall, and differences in the wilting point, how much soil water is available for crop uptake. So thinking about temperate cropping systems and plant available water, rainfall is part of it. It's a big part of it, but it's not the only part of it. This is not a soil science course, so I'm not going to really quiz you or ask you to, any of this information on an exam. But it's important to note that this plant available water, the difference between field capacity and wilting point, while it's strongly determined by soil texture, other soil properties influence it. Things like porosity, soil organic matter, soil strength, or soil structure. And crop management decisions have an impact on these soil properties. Things like tillage, things like residue management, things like, for example, the use of cover crops. And so crop management is going to have a feedback effect onto soil properties, which will have another effect on how much plant available water a crop can use. And climatic factors like average rainfall, as well as things like soil texture, are going to influence plant available water, and the amount of plant available water will in turn influence the G and M components of cropping systems. So first would be something like crop selection, and then cultivar or hybrid selection. So there's a reason why on the prairies, which receive much less rainfall than eastern Canada, wheat and canola are predominant crops, and that's because they can yield with much less rainfall as opposed to something like corn, which has much higher transpirational requirements. Now, even in a crop like corn, you can have varieties that are at least supposedly more drought tolerant than others, right? Some companies market corn that's drought tolerant as an example. And so, the hybrid and cultivar selection will be affected by, how much, at a climatic level, how much rainfall you expect to receive in a given year. Production intensity is also influenced by expectations about rainfall in a given growing season. Things like fallow were much more common on the prairies, again, because it was much drier. And so farmers wanted to conserve soil moisture and build it up over a year with fallow. In Ontario and Quebec, we can have excess soil moisture, especially in the spring, in the planting season, when the soil is often saturated. And so tile drainage is much more common in Ontario and Quebec to help drain that excess water quickly in the spring than it is in the prairies, where there's very little tile drainage or almost none. Residue management is also going to is going to be affected by plant available water. So remember in the prairies how I talked about in an earlier lecture that no-till is becoming more and more common. And no-till leaves surface residue on the surface soil, and it acts like a mulch, that residue does, protecting the soil from erosion and shading it and reducing evaporation, which is part of evapotranspiration. And so by keeping residue on top of the soil, you can conserve soil moisture. But again, in the spring, like in a place like in eastern Ontario, in eastern Canada, Ontario and Quebec, you might want to, as a farmer, manage that soil by burying it, essentially getting it off of the surface of the soil, incorporating it into the soil so that you can allow that soil to dry out because there's no mulch there. You're getting rid of that layer of residue that can act as a habitat for unwanted insects like slugs that can damage plants. So there are some benefits depending on where you are in Canada to residue management. Tillage, as I've spoken about before, tends to dry soil out, and so there's relative advantages to tillage and disadvantages to tillage depending on how much rainfall a given environment receives. G and M components of cropping systems also influence plant available moisture, so there's this interaction going on. For example, any management change that reduces runoff or increases infiltration is going to increase plant available moisture. And so, for example, that can be something like residue management, growing cover crops that can reduce runoff and increase infiltration on slopes. For example, the direction of tillage, so ridge tillage as opposed to tilling up and down slopes, tilling across them can reduce erosion and runoff. Multiple factors, and we're not going to touch on them all here. Factors that increase the speed of canopy closure, that increase early season leaf area index, are also going to essentially increase plant available moisture. And the way they do that is by reducing evaporation. So remember that evapotranspiration is total water output from that system, and the less water that evaporates, the more water that's available to be transpired by that crop. And so any practice that reduces that evaporation, especially early in the season, is going to keep moisture in that soil available for crop use later. And again, we're not in a soil science class, but there's many management factors that are going to influence soil properties, which in turn will influence plant available moisture.